Yes, good morning everyone, and very warm welcome from quite a cold Stellenbosch here. I think we've got snow on the mountains, and it's great to be with you. I think we've certainly missed meeting together face to face over the last couple of months, but it's been really great to continue the discussion in this forum. And I'm privileged this morning to introduce Dr. Garth Japhet to you, our guest for today. And yeah, he's a familiar face to those who've been around TGIF for a bit longer. He's been a regular speaker. We were hoping to have him earlier this year, and then lockdown happened, and that changed all of our plans. But it's wonderful to have you with us this morning, Garth. So just a few words of introduction. So Garth is CEO of Heartlands. It's an award-winning NGO. He's also a medical doctor with a specialty in maternal and child health. In 1992, he co-founded Soul City, which was a health-focused edutainment project. He's also a Schwab Fellow of the World Economic Forum and a number of other initiatives he's involved in, the African Leadership Initiative and so on. So it's great to have you with us this morning, Garth, and we really look forward to you speaking to us. So his topic for this morning is something he's been thinking about quite a bit recently. His NGO, Heartlands, has been involved in. The topic is empathy as 21st century gold, building bridges through stories in a time of isolation. I think it's a very important topic for us today. I think Garth will probably share why this has been very much on his heart as well. But maybe Garth, just to get us started, we're going to do it a little bit differently, as Thorsten said this morning as well. It's going to be more of an interview style format. But maybe, Garth, you can begin by just sharing a little bit of your own journey, a little bit of your family life. You started as a doctor, moved into social change projects, NGOs. Maybe you can share a little bit of that journey with us before, just to give us a little bit of context.
Thanks, John Paul, and good morning to everyone. It's really a privilege to be able to spend some time with you this morning. I grew up in Johannesburg, and I had all the right ingredients to be a lawyer, except that, I didn't become a lawyer, because when I decided that in fact medicine might be more of a way in which to change society, I had a few sort of obstacles to that course. One is I used to faint at the sight of blood. I did not do particularly well in maths or science, and didn't do biology for matric. I then went on to do A-levels in English and history. Now, these are all great ingredients for medicine, but in God's strange way, I actually managed to get into medicine, not only got into it, but completed medicine at Wits University. But underlying it all was a deep desire to sort of make a difference in our continent, on our land. And that led me to initially working in KwaZulu-Natal, and then 5 years in Alexandra Township, where I worked at Alexandra Clinic in the early 90s. And it was in that period that I realized that so much of what we see as doctors is preventable. I was responsible for child health, and we were seeing at least probably one, if not two, dead kids coming into the clinic from dehydration due to diarrhea in Alexandra Township in the middle of Johannesburg. And it really got me thinking around prevention and how so much of the disease and the suffering in our world is preventable. And that was a sort of leap into thinking around the use of communication. And probably quite fortuitously, I have no background in communication. And so intuitively, I started to think, well, what's popular? What is it that grabs me? And the answer to that was story. Growing up, I used to bunk school to listen to the radio serials in the morning. I remember telling my mother how sore my throat was because I wanted to get into the next episode. And so intuitively, I sort of began to realize that if we told stories that basically sort of ingrained health issues into the stories, maybe that was a way to deal with some of these really key issues. And that was the birth of Soul City, which became a primetime TV drama series, radio in 9 languages, by the time we'd finished over 20 years, about 45 million print publications. So I had this journey into the use of story. And in the midst of that, I became a Christian. and decided that, you know, maybe there was another reason for why God had laid this understanding of the strength of story and narrative on my heart, and maybe it was beyond just health. And that led to understanding that so much, you know, if we look at our continent, one of the most Christian continents on the planet, and yet there is a huge gap between what we think and what we do, between our faith and between our action. And I wondered then whether that might not be the way to start dealing, to almost help people through story, to become the people that many of us would like to be, to connect the gap between faith and action. On the personal front, I am married to a doctor. She is right now working at Helderberg Hospital in the COVID ward, so it is very personal. And I have two children, Rebecca, 19, who's doing occupational therapy, and Lee, who's 15, who's still at school. So I don't know, John, that's
yes, thank you.
a long story to a short question.
Yeah, no, but lovely. Thank you. That gives us a little bit of context. And yeah, I think the power of stories, you know, people often point out, and I think it's being rediscovered in a sense that the Bible is a big story, you know, and that many of Jesus' messages were stories. And so, yeah, you can maybe share a little bit more about that in a moment. But maybe let's get into this morning's topic particularly. You've been thinking recently about empathy, the importance of empathy. Here in your title, you say empathy is 21st century gold. Can you maybe just share with us, why do you think it's such an important skill?
So I'd like to just tell you a story, which is how about 3-4 years ago, I was part of World Economic Forum thing called the Global Agenda Council. And in that time, I went to a meeting where it was focusing on the sort of global future. And the sort of general sense was that our global future was this fourth industrial revolution. And for those of you not familiar with the term, it's the next wave of mechanization, of particularly the computer-driven AI and so on. And one of the big topics in that sort of meeting was how so many jobs that are currently, you know, our accounting jobs, our engineering jobs, are the things that require sort of logical thinking, are going to be replaced in years to come by the computer age, by the fourth industrial revolution. But the one thing that is not going to be replaced anytime soon is the human capacity for empathy and compassion. And the need to develop those skills will be what defines the workplace or enables people to compete in a different workplace in years to come. And so that's why it sort of realized that in fact it's not necessarily the sort of our ability to use computers, it's our ability to care that is going to for others, that is going to define who succeeds in the 21st century. Another thing happened in that meeting, which I met the head of the Columbia University School of Public Health, and she was having a discussion with me, and she said to me, do you know, we worry so much, and this is clearly pre-COVID, but it is as important and perhaps even more important now. She says the diseases that we've all been worrying about are, you know, HIV/AIDS and things of obesity and diabetes and hypertension and all of these things. She says the biggest health issue in the 21st century is loneliness, and that loneliness is going to kill more people than all these diseases combined. And I said to her, well, you know, that sounds like a huge over-exaggeration. And she said, not at all. She said, you know, more people, like I think in the States now, over 40% of people, I mean, and forgive me, my statistic may be wrong, but it's a lot of people are living alone. And this was pre-COVID. And so this combination of these two streams of saying 21st century, which will be dominated by the fourth industrial revolution, the need for empathy as a skill, And the flip side of that, which is that loneliness is going to be the biggest public health challenge. And so it really, that really sort of crystallized my thinking around why it is so important to, for us all, young and old, to really focus on this thing of empathy.
So that deep sense of empathy. So I think you've sketched out why it's so important. Maybe you can just share a little bit. So this has been on your heart, and you've developed a program to help people grow in this particular area of empathy and being able to enter into other people's experiences, listening to their stories and so on. Can you maybe share a little bit about that and that journey as well? And I think it was also particularly related to your concern for the racial tensions in our own country. Originally, if I recall our previous conversation. And I think that's even been exacerbated more by what's going on with the racial tensions in the US and around the world. So I think it's a very important topic, but can you share with us a little bit about this program that you've developed?
Yes, so JP, I mean, the third leg of that, so loneliness, the issue around the fourth industrial revolution, and probably the third leg of that, not just in South Africa, but globally, is this retreating back into national ethnic groups. We see it, the rise of the nationalist politics, racial issues, not just in this country, but globally. And so obviously with our own history, as an organization, Heartlands, about 4 or 5 years ago, we realized that, post 94, beyond the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was an amazing initiative and I think, did bring healing to some, there had really been nothing that the everyman could almost embrace. I mean, we realized that the issues of the last 300 years were not just suddenly going to be replaced by nirvana. And yet, beyond sort of bringing in sort of, the professionals to come and run a workshop, what was there that the ordinary everyday man could do to say, actually, I want to do something about reconciliation. I want to do something about moving across the chasm that exists between many of us. And so, as Heartlands does, we set out on a research process to look around the world at perhaps was there anything else that had been attempted at scale. We looked at Palestine, Israel, we looked at Northern Ireland and many other areas which had extended periods of division and conflict. And we couldn't find anything. We couldn't find anything that had sort of happened outside of sort of small groups of people gathering with facilitators. And strangely, we almost stumbled on something which we just found to be revolutionary in our own organization. We started once a week to get one of our staff members, and we're about 35, to share their story. And it was just a way for us to sort of begin the week. Each week, somebody else would come in and they would begin to share their story. And we realized that this was absolutely transformatory, is particularly in terms of how the assumptions that we had made about each other. Because you're a white guy, then this is your background. Because you are black, that means you grew up in poverty, and so on and so on. Because you're a woman, and so on and so on. And we realized that this was an assumption buster of the most amazing kind. And we realized that we'd stumbled on what was the thing that we can all do, which is to get to know each other's stories. And we sort of formularized it into something very simple, which we call ask, listen, tell. And ask is, it's very, there's a reason for the order. The ask is very much because we need to reach out first and find out a little bit more about the people around us, not just the people who look different. And I think that's what the key sort of thing is here. This is not just about race. It's about one's own family. It's about the people who look the same as you. We sort of pass each other, we work together, but do we actually know each other a little bit deeper? And so it was saying, get to know, ask and get to know a little bit more about the people that you interact with every day in your church, in your workplace, even the security guard in your building or wherever it may be. Ask them their name, where does that come from, etc. And then the second most sort of important ingredient, and which we have learned so much about in recent years, is listening. Is that, I'm not a great listener, and I've had to really concentrate on that skill. But when you ask, you first of all, by asking, it's this amazing Zulu phrase of sawubona, is just in the whole process of asking, you're saying, I see you. And that alone is sort of stepping across the chasm between people. And then listening really is a gift that you're giving by really intentionally listening. And then the third thing is telling, is being prepared to share your own story. So that was the genesis of it. But as we, as Heartlands, operate, we realize that big stories actually are fantastic to initiate conversations. If we've got time, I'll tell you a little bit about the neuroscience of story and why we are, as human beings, why we are hot-wired for story. But we produced a film called Beyond the River. And Beyond the River is the story, actually it's a true story, although we fictionalized it, of two men, one a young black man from a Soweto township, the other a middle-aged white school teacher, who combined to win gold in the Duzi Canoe Marathon. And the story is not about canoeing, although that obviously is the backdrop. It is a story of how these two men start their journey together with these assumptions about who the other person is. You're middle-aged, white, rich guy, that means X, and you're a poor black guy, this means Y. And they're forced to confront those assumptions. And by doing that, they build up a level of trust and understanding, which enables them to compete and win. And it's an amazing analogy for our country, is that we are all in the same boat. And we have got to, unless we begin to reach across the boundaries between us and get to know each other better, to build understanding and trust, we're not going to win this race. And so that was one of the key building blocks. The other was 3 different areas of helping people, giving guidelines for use of What's Your Story in the church. We have trained, I think now, over 14,000 people in the use of What's Your Story. At last count, about 2,500 churches have adopted What's Your Story. We've used it in schools. We've used it with great effect, or it is being used with great effect in the workplace, where, like we experienced, people are using this to break down barriers in the workplace. And then the final setting, which we're beginning to move into in this time, particularly of isolation, is in the home. It was an eye-opener to me. We started this, as I say, 4 or 5 years ago, and I was realized I had a very elderly mother, that although I'd had snippets of her story, I'd never actually sat down and got her story. And because of what we were doing, I sat down intentionally with her and I recorded her. And it was transformatory for me, in that it just gave me insight and empathy, perhaps for some of the things that she'd done and been over the years, huge respect for some of the obstacles I'd never known were there that she'd overcome. So that is the program. That's What's Your Story. And we can talk a bit about some of the evaluation that has been done, but the impact has been extraordinary.
Yeah, so maybe that's a good point now, Garth. You said you have a little trailer for Beyond the River, or are there some videos? I think it might be a good point now to share that, just to give people a little bit of a flavor for what you've been up to the last few years.
Okay, well, I think what I'll do is I'll share the trailer of Beyond the River. I will share my screen with you.
Once idusi uyenza kayi-1 uzizwa ngathi ayikho into engakuhlula emhlabeni. 5 4 3 2 1 go.
That's like a machine. He's won 9 golds in the Duzi.
Quick. Next year I want to do the race.
Maybe I can do it with you. Why don't you partner with this Duma kid? I mean, he's seriously talented. Should have seen him when he was younger. Didn't we used to call you something? Helicopter. Hey, helicopter. This guy is good, man. He just needs a break. Attack, man!
Hey, man, no tell one thing, Mr. Canoe. What can't we choose about Kren? He was a fella la.
Ngathina mesidla uBansdale thina kubamba athletes.
Umuntu ufuna ukuphila impilo yakho ngesibaba.
Ngiyabona man. Usho ukuthi wena ufuna umngane ozokuthatha kise phezulu. Akubuyisa kushayise phansi wena etakeni.
What are you doing, Japhet? And what do you want to do?
I want to be a somebody. It's me, Steve, it's Duma.
I wanted to talk about canoeing.
We can try. I'm not saying it's gonna work or anything. We can try.
Steve, me, I'm scared of those things.
What's it gonna do to you?
Bite me. You white people here call your dogs nice things, with fluffy. With me, where I come from, we call them Hitler.
Stay on my shoulder! Don't force it, man.
We were hopeless. I've done 15 flippin' doozies. How many you done? You blew your mouth.
This is not okay.
I think that we should see a psychologist.
Why do you want to do this race with me?
You're strong, and you don't give up. And I want to be like that.
Ngakhohlwa ukuthi uyinika uNkulunkulu lento. And into oyinika uNkulunkulu akekho umuntu ozoyithatha.
You're the one who said we must become like one person, and we're not.
Is that the ocean? Yeah, it's the first time I see it.
And just looking at that trailer, I think I'm excited. It looks like a wonderful story. And I think just many of those, the reaction to the dog, the different perceptions and, just those deep cultural differences and understanding where other people are coming from. It looks like a wonderful tool, I think, to get some of those conversations going. We actually host a film club here in Stellenbosch. Maybe that should be our next film to have a look at. Yeah.
So it should, with any luck, it was on Mnet, it's on Box Office, but we're just doing a deal at the moment with the SABC. So we're hoping it will be on the SABC in September. So yeah, it's an amazing tool. One of the things that most of what happens out there with What's Your Story, we actually, people get on with it themselves. But we do one extraordinary thing where we bring particularly leaders together over a 2-day process. We call it a bridge. And it's often, we've done it extensively with church leaders. So for instance, in Pretoria, we started off with a group of church leaders in Pretoria from different backgrounds who had been in ministers fraternal. And we do a 2-day process where they walk in not expecting a huge amount, and we get to hear everybody's story. And at the end of that, the transformation on many sort of relationships, towns, has been extraordinary. So what started as 30 people, mainly white, basically now is 200 pastors in Pretoria meeting on a regular basis. The same has happened in Potchefstroom, the same happened in PE, the same has happened in Neisner. And people have been, is that when we get to know each other's stories, when we build empathy between people, we realize just how much we have in common, one, and how many assumptions we make just simply based on what we look like. So that's just been extraordinary. And as I say, there's a big evaluation, which shows that over 80% of people who've been exposed or trained in What's Your Story go on then to use it in different settings.
No, wonderful. And even as you're speaking now about church leaders coming together, I'm part of a fraternal here, and we had sort of the land issues here in Stellenbosch particularly recently, and we had church leaders coming together, and I think one of the difficulties was just not really knowing each other or having those relationships. And a tool like this would be very valuable in that particular area. You said that the tool is also available for in other contexts. Maybe you can share a little bit as well. So you've done this work with, particularly with church leaders, but you mentioned the workplace as well. So what would you envision there? Maybe a CEO who's interested in his team working well together, making use of that. Maybe you can share a little bit of some of the tools that you would give to such a person to get What's Your Story going. You also mentioned something like bringing an object that's of significance to you and talking about it, something like that. What are some of those tools that you use?
Well, I think two things, JP. One is just the beauty of What's Your Story is that it's simple and anybody can do it. It's just ask, listen, tell. And a lot of people, that is the strength of it, that it doesn't need a zillion workbooks and things. However, having said that, we have, if you go onto Heartlands' website, we have an entire sort of array of tools that can be used in the church, in the workplace, and so on. In the workplace, it's dependent. We've now worked with about 40 different companies who have used this in very different ways. So we give them ideas, sometimes they go away, like the Advertising Association, and I'll perhaps play a 2-minute clip of some of their reactions after having gone through this, all the way through to the Banking Council. And the key understanding is similar, but we work in different ways. We do things we like get people to draw something called the River of Life, which is you draw a diagram. I mean, I'm a very poor artist, but you take a river, you see your life as a river, and you see, the bends in the river, which have been sort of times you took a different course, the obstacles, the rocks that you managed to get through, and you use the analogy to actually then describe it. And people, meet as a group and then talk about their river of life. The other thing is that, as you mentioned, we take we ask people to take in an object or a picture that sparks a particular memory and a story. And clearly, people are willing to share different levels of intimacy. Some people are very willing to go very deep, and so for some people, it's the first time they've ever told their story. And so it's much easier for them just to say, just give us find a picture and talk to us about that picture and why it's meaningful. And invariably, that is a starting point actually for their entire story. The other thing is that we ask them to talk about a fork in the road, when there was a point in your life that direction changed. That again is just it's an entry point for what then often becomes a much deeper discussion. So, as I say, there's a range of different tools and approaches, but it all comes down to helping people to do 3 things. Helping people to ask. So some people, for instance, Live Village in KwaZulu-Natal, we have used What's Your Story? And they instituted a thing where Live would sponsor a cup of coffee. If you invited somebody else in your team for a cup of coffee, they'd pay for the coffees. But the idea was that you spent a bit of time getting to know each other's stories. So there's just, it's almost endless, the different ways in which you can go about this. And then listening tools. There's some lovely little videos that we've put together around listening. And then, as we've spoken about, the telling.
Thanks so much, Garth. And I would love to get into people's questions. I'm sure people have a lot of questions for you. I think unless there's something more you want to share. I mean, I've got some of my own little questions about how you put this into practice. During lockdown, our domestic worker, I go and pick her up. She's about 20 minutes out of Stellenbosch. And so I've got this 20 minutes with her in the car. And how do I make use of that time? So I mean, there's, I think, a very practical example. And I think just listening to this has sort of inspired me to think through, am I using this time to listen to her story? And it's quite difficult sometimes, you feel that there's quite a big gap there, so maybe some advice for me. Just what kind of questions, do I ask, about her background, How does one get into those conversations?
I think, again, it's about being curious. It's about, asking a little bit more about what's important in that person's life. I mean, the origin of her name, where did she grow up? What was her earliest memory? As I say, this is not rocket science. It's really about being curious. And as I say, it comes back to this thing. Even if there are no magic questions. It's really around when I move into your world, when I truly am saying Sawubona, I see you. So we've got a bunch of questions that you could look at. But again, it really stems from this thing of trying to find little touch points which will enable her maybe to open up about bits and pieces of her life. As I say, earliest memory, how did you come to be in Stellenbosch? Have you always lived here? Tell me about your mother. Did you know your dad? And so on and so on. So,
yeah. Yeah, I think it begins really with that heart of wanting to know, wanting to take a real interest in those around us, and as a way of actually going forward together. I think I would. Is there something more you particularly want to?
No, I think what we've done as well is we're just about to do something that people can do this online. We're about to release a thing so that you can do this, like we're doing it now, but on Zoom or if you're part of a church small group or you've got a friend group, how to do this actually on Zoom, how to do this at home, and again, encourage us older people to get the stories of some of the younger people out there, and vice versa. There is so much that we don't know about older people, and again, the key to this process is not about race; it's about everybody. It just so happens that it's an amazing way of understanding across racial groups. But I'm very, persuaded that we need to do this for people who look the same as us, as much as we need to do it as people who look different to ourselves.
Yes, no. I think I think that there's quite a bit, as you mentioned a bit earlier, some of the neuroscience and so on, how we're in many ways hardwired for story and for empathy. But it's also obviously something you can grow in. And it's something, as I've been thinking about the subject, I think also as Christians, there's this deep theological underpinning as well, of a God who, in Jesus Christ, entered into the world, empathized with us in our sufferings and in our joys. And to me, that's also, that story is also very important in a sense that ought to be driving me. That's why I want to get to know the stories of those around me. But I think let's open it up to the floor for questions. So let's move to a time of questions. I'm sure you have lots of questions for Garth. So let's get some of those rolling. I'll maybe see who has the first question for us, and I will. So it's Marty. Marty's. Can we hand over to you, Marty?
How's it? Thanks. Thanks a lot for the talk, Garth. And I think just that one, there's various moments in the movie Beyond the River where the guy actually starts defending the guy who's canoeing with him, but previously he used to attack other people for those sort of traits. So that empathy was demonstrated when previously he held a view, but because he got to know the guy, when other people were saying things about the guy, he started actually defending him because it became personal to him. And I think that's that empathy that's so important that it almost isn't important to us until it happens to us. I don't know if that's making sense.
Yeah, Marty. Yeah, absolutely. It was, they begin in one point, and they because of the understanding and they're now connecting at a human level. They've although the one is a young black guy and the other is a middle-aged white guy, that barrier has moved away. And so that's exactly what happens, as you say, in the course of the movie. And that really is part of what we were trying to depict through that storyline.
I think interesting how that empathy leads to advocacy, actually, for those who we empathize with as well. Nduluma has his hand up. Would you, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, JP. Thank you, Garth, for your presentation. I obliquely had an experience with What's Your Story when it was rolled out at our church. I'm good friends with Navilia, so we had a good time with it. My question is, however, that I find that I think in the process of empathy, a lot of people take the approach of being extractive. So you approach someone and almost like what you're trying to do is extract information, as opposed to really be relational in the sense of valuing the person. I think that the beginning point, even as we're in the matrix of trying to figure each other out in terms of a race perspective, is that we should value each other based on the fact that everybody's made in the image of God. So it really shouldn't be, technically speaking, that difficult to just see everybody in that way, though we have our prejudices and we come from different places. But there's something I want to zero in on very quickly, which is what a friend of mine said to me in Zulu. I'm not Zulu myself, but he said there are two ways in which identity is seen in Zulu. So there's itakazelo, which is the inherited identity, so your family, all those parameters about who you are, right? And then izibongelo is almost like a made-up identity. It involves what your aspirations are, who you want to be, who you see yourself as navigating the world. And I think part of the problem with how we view empathy is that we only focus on the bit that's izitagazelo, the inherited bit. So you look at who they are, where they come from, all the stuff, the parameters that are fixed, instead of looking at the other end, which is their ambitions, their aspirations, who they want to be and see themselves in the world. And that gives you a fuller picture to empathize with somebody. So I think we're very reductive when we look at people and we don't relate to them in authentic ways. I don't know if I can extract a response from you. Thank you.
Are you being extractive?
I am indeed. Just as far as response is concerned, though.
No, I think you make a very valid point, and part of getting to know people's story is understanding what their dream is for their future. How they see themselves in the world and moving forward, and that's sort of the next level of relationship. This is where you've come from, but what is your story going forward? I think as human beings, we're complicated. So some people, it will be we'll do it in a way that doesn't allow people to talk a little bit about who they want to be or want to be seen as in the world. But I think your point is very valid around, it isn't just about the past. It's, as I understand what you're saying, it is all about what is it, how would you like to be seen now and into the future? What is the narrative of your story into the future? Maybe just two things. The other, now we're sort of moving slightly away, but this is, I think the key thing about this is that anybody can learn it. Some of us are introverts by nature, but the more curious, and as you were saying, JP, it is the beginning of loving each other, is to be curious and trying to move into each other's worlds. So yeah, the other thing is how we tell our stories can also influence how we progress into the future. So we can either look back at our stories as a series of failures and obstacles, or we can turn it as Debbie Kirsten, who is Michael Cassidy's daughter, married to Gary Kirsten, has got this thing about helping people to reimagine their story, and she gets them to draw the troughs and the peaks of their life story experience. And then once they've done that, I lost this relationship, or this happened, or this trauma, those are the troughs. And then at the end of that exercise, she gets them to turn over the things so that the troughs actually become the peaks. And it's such a powerful analogy for how we reflect our story. And coming back to your question, is that how we look at our backstory can have a very powerful effect on how we move into the future. And it's, you know, it's part of what narratives therapy is about, is helping you to reframe your story.
Yes, I think that's an important point. Any further questions? I see there is a question here from Viv Spooner in the chat room. I'm interested in hearing more about the neuroscience of story. So maybe Garth, you can maybe just share a little bit of that, and yeah, while others also wait to ask further questions, maybe you can go a little bit into that as well.
Yeah, again, you know, not to complicate it, but essentially the way in which our brains are wired. For instance, if I give you a series of facts, they do neuroimaging. If I give you a bunch of facts, a very small part of your brain will light up. If I tell you a story, you get this this transference, this where I experience, you know, if I tell you about well, let's use the example you've just seen, the canoeing. When you saw those images of the water, of the guy battling against the you know, pulling the paddle and so on, is that the part of your brain that actually lit up was the motor part of your brain. Is that stories give you a whole brain experience. Is that when I talk about amazing smells, the sensory part of your brain will light up. If I describe the most extraordinary sunset, the image part of your brain, the seeing part of your brain will light up. And so story is an immersive brain experience, which is why we remember story. Whereas, you know, fact, which is why, you know, billboards, I'm on a mission at the moment around COVID and around messaging around COVID. But just putting up a bunch of facts does not really impact on the human psyche. Whereas where we tell a story, we engage the emotions and we engage the full brain, and we stimulate various forms of neurochemistry. And so it's fascinating how, you know, coming all the way back to the Bible is that it's no accident that the Bible is a story, because that is how God has wired us. It is no accident that Jesus used parables, because that is how, you know, he has wired us. And he didn't give us he didn't spend his time sort of spending with a bunch of facts.
Great. Maybe Torsten, I see you have a question there. Yeah, what's your question?
Garth, I'm wondering if my story is broken, what do I do with that? Can I fix it? Do I bin it? Can it be healed? Do I swap it for another story? What do we do?
Well, Torsten, just coming back to this point that we can look at our stories in two different ways. You know, as Debbie Kirsten uses this things about troughs and peaks, is that we can either look back at our story as a, you know, and look at the hard times in that story and see it as a series of failures, or I can actually reauthor it, revision it, and say, well, actually, I moved through that period, and here I am now. There were elements of triumph through adversity. I managed to come through things, and you know, again, the research is very compelling around just how powerful it is to how we view our story. So what you may see as a broken story, you can be helped to see as not a broken story, as a story that you've managed to, you know, within the brokenness there has been patches of light, and to focus on that rather than on the brokenness. And again, you know, the research is very clear about just how powerful that is in terms of, you know, coming back to the earlier point about you know, how we engage with our futures, is that it is incredibly powerful in terms of how to revision your future if you can re-look at how your past was, and not see brokenness, but perhaps see some periods of triumph.
I would also say on that, as I was thinking, that it's a deeply Christian insight that God is able to bring good out of those trough periods, and that crucible of suffering can actually bring life out of death, you know. I'm thinking about John's gospel and his portrayal of Jesus on the cross, you know, one of the greatest tragedies, an innocent man, and yet John speaks about it as a moment of glory, you know, of refusing to repay his enemies evil for evil. Of loving his enemies. You know, this is actually his moment of glory. And so it's a deeply Christian insight as well. I think that your story can be turned around in that way. But I see Stella has unmuted herself. Stella, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Garth. That was wonderful. I just wanted to ask, I mean, maybe this is a difficult question to answer, but we're all in lockdown and we're reading and we're watching, and I was wondering if there are any novels or any books that you had specifically read that had been stories that had captured your heart, you know, not just now, but at any point, anything that you would recommend, or even series that you'd watched or anything like that. Thanks.
Sure, Stella. I mean, you know, if you're interested in story, there's a wonderful book called The Storytelling Animal, which really, you know, is a great introduction to the history of story through the ages and to the neuroscience, to all of that. It's beautifully written, and I would highly recommend that if you're interested in story. Yeah, I'm afraid haven't managed to do a huge amount of watching. Been quite involved in the trying to work. We've set up an initiative called Church in Action, which has been around the coronavirus. But one of the things that, you know, I left out in my own story is that there were stories that have influenced. The reason I'm a doctor today actually was about a series of books that was written in the 1950s. Called The Jungle Doctor, by a missionary doctor called Dr. Paul White. And it was reading those books as teenagers that inspired me for some of the right reasons and a lot of the wrong reasons to become a doctor. You know, if none of you have read any of the C.S. Lewis books, you know, between C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, the two who probably inspired me around how you can tell stories that are deeply Christian and deeply godly without actually mentioning the word of God. And so, yeah, those are books that I read and reread. The other thing that to say that in this period is, many people have never actually sat down and tried to write down their own story. And it is what really, you know, as a confused young man, was one of the things that a priest actually got me to do, was to spend time writing down my own story. And that is actually quite amazing, if any of you have not done that before. And it's, again, this ask, listen, tell. It's often when people are asked to tell their story in a group or whatever, it's often the first time that they've actually spent time really looking at it. So it can be an extraordinarily insightful and in many times healing thing to do with this time. It's actually and a gift to others to write down your story. I see that on the chat there are a bunch of yes, and I can see lots of wonderful notes here around great books, and I look forward to reading those chats and series. I've been also watching Call the Midwife with my wife. That's a beautiful, gentle story, which in these times I think is actually quite a balm on the soul.
Thanks.
So a book that I found very helpful on empathy is a book by Alan Alda, of the MASH fame, and the title is "If I Understood You, Would I Have This Look on My Face?" So he works with a university in the States trying to train doctors how to be more empathetic. And I heard him on an interview with Kate Bowler, who has stage 4 cancer. I forget what all it is, but she has a podcast. And she was just saying, as a cancer patient, it was very difficult because doctors weren't empathetic. They just treated her as cancer, not as a human being. And so I guess the science, it's actually a very entertaining book, but it's typical his humor, but he uses his improvisation to really help doctors to listen and in a way that really helps them get into behind the skin of the patient. So that's just a recommendation that I have.
Great. So it's interesting. I remember some of our professors, if you dared touch the patient before you got their full story, you were sort of banished. Empathy 101 was, so don't speak about the disease. Who is your patient? So yeah, I'd love to, if you could put that on the chat, the name of that book would be great.
Marty, I see he's unmuted as well.
Yeah, I just asked a question in the link just about group size to for this, because obviously if the group becomes too large, I think the one thing about sharing is actually you need to become vulnerable to be able to be open. And if the group gets too big, you lose that authenticity and sincerity. So I was asking, is there sort of a size limit? And then also, I don't think the thing works if it isn't done authentically and sincerely in the asking of the question, as was said earlier, and also in the way that a person, because they're going to be vulnerable in telling their story. It may be something very personal and very painful, as you said. It's not always a good story, and I think people need to be mature in receiving the story as well.
Yeah, Marty, again, if you go onto our resources, there's a lot about how to create safe spaces, the numbers involved. So when you are doing this in a group setting, whether it is in a small group from a church or your business or wherever, we sort of usually between sort of 6 and 8 people is enough. More than that, and it becomes, as you say, it's difficult for it to feel like a safe space. It depends if people know each other already. So, for instance, in our offices, we do it with 30 people, but we know each other. I think just maybe as a final thought, the one thing talking about the coronavirus is the one thing that this virus has shown us is just how interconnected we all are, and if anything has shown us how interconnected the human race is, it's this virus, and yet we are becoming more and more isolated. And so I think the need for empathy as we move into this next century, this period, has been heightened by the virus. The need to reach out to each other, to the acknowledgement that we are, as humans, we are completely interconnected, and we need to really both acknowledge that and make a real effort to build empathy between us.
Thanks, Garth. And I think that's a good point perhaps to wrap up the discussion this morning. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, particularly to you, Garth, for joining us. Garth is going to stick around a little bit longer for those who maybe want to ask him some more questions.
So another question I have, Garth, is just, I don't know if you noticed recently, it was in the news, Twitter had this, what I think is really an outrageous response to I think it's probably just them trying to get some capitalistic publicity out of this whole mess we're in terms of race relations, etc. in the world. But Twitter dropped the words slave and master in its programming language. I think it was extremely lazy and trite. It's just trying to, cash in on the environment we're in at the moment. And I just thought, corporates have such an unflattering pedigree of just trying to be nominal about their responses, not really going on a truthful sort of exploration or doing something meaningful. I mean, Twitter has so much influence, and if they wanted to do something about the environment right now and say something in the race equation, they could do something much more than just drop a slave and master, the use of slave and master. I think it's a programming thing. And I'm like, look, words have meaning beyond race. Dropping that is so trite and petty. So I just wanted to also get your response, just in terms of how the process can be authentic and people can commit to it in meaningful ways. And I mean, we also shouldn't defer to these interventions as being the be all and end all, because we have to do the work on ourselves personally to become more empathic, etc. So yeah, but I was quite irritated by Twitter's very, very lazy and trite response to all of this.
Yeah, thanks. Nduluma, I think the danger, well, not the danger, but I think what your story is, it's not the answer. There is so much more to building bridges, to looking at our past. I think just because I get to know somebody's story doesn't mean to say that I've done the work. But it is very much, for instance, we've seen it in companies. You talk about Twitter, but where there's been a deep commitment from the leader of a company or a church to a process that goes on for a number of years. I think specifically of the leader of the Dutch Reformed Church, a big Dutch Reformed Church in Potchefstroom, who has really, has gone out and been, fairly unpopular in the way in which he has said, this is, yes, we're going to use what's your story, but there is so much more that we're going to need to do. And he's walked this walk for a number of years, and I think that is what I think you're saying here, is that it's not just about dropping words or a couple of small interventions. It's about a complete relook at who we are. I speak for myself as a white person, but I do, when I do hear the pain of a number of my black colleagues, it's an opportunity for me to apologize for a system that I, inadvertently was part of. And strangely, the ability to do that, or what feels like a small thing, is often quite huge. So, yeah, I think the key thing here is that what you're saying is simple words or just going through a process is not enough. It's about a complete change of the way in which we operate.